What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is December 8th, 2025, about 7:55 p.m. where I'm at right now. And we are continuing our 17th book in our Book to React series. This is episode 7 of A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity, written by the mysterious professor, Thomas Hardy Leahey. We were in our previous episode reading about Aristotle's theories. He built on Plato's ideas about forms and the meaning of life and searching for true beauty and searching for truth. And we were in the middle of reading Aristotle's more scientific approach to science that feels more intuitive to us. I highly suggest everybody go watch episode 6 and all the other previous episodes of us reading this book cover to cover. Without further ado, we will continue reading. We will read for about an hour today. We are starting right here on Aristotle's parts on developing psychology. Let's go. Psychology, soul and body. For Aristotle, psychology was the study of the soul, that which differentiates the animate from the inanimate worlds. Aristotle defines the soul as the form of natural body having life potentially within it. All living things possess souls as their form, and thus it is a living thing's soul that defines its nature. What is to be that living thing? Soul is the actuality and the actualizing, directing force of any living organism, fulfilling the body's potential having of life. As the form of a living thing, soul is thus the essential, efficient, and final cause of an organism. An essential cause. The soul is what defines an animal or plant. A cat is a cat because it has a cat's soul and therefore behaves like a cat. The soul is the efficient cause of bodily growth and movement, and of life processes generally. Without soul, the body is not actualized and is dead, mere matter. The soul is also the final cause of an organism, for the body serves the soul and the soul guides as purposive. The soul guides its purposive development and activity. To summarize, of any living organism, the material cause is the body of which the living thing is made, and the soul is the form, being the efficient cause of life processes, being the animal's essence, and being the organism's final cause, the purpose of the body. Aristotle's view of the relation of soul to body is different from Plato's. As he rejected the separability of the forms, Aristotle rejected the separability of soul and body, the dualism of Plato, the Pythagoreans, Descartes, and of many religions. The form of a statue is not a separate thing added to bronze to make it a statue. Similarly, as the form of the body, the soul is not a separate thing added to the body. An organism is a unity. Without soul, the body is dead. Without body, there is no soul. That is, no form to define the matter of the body as a particular knowable being. Aristotle put it this way in On the Soul. That is why we can wholly dismiss as unnecessary the question whether the soul and the body are one. It is as meaningless to ask whether the wax and the shape given to it by the stamp are one. Aristotle evades the ways of thinking about mind and body ushered in by Descartes. He is not a dualist with Plato, Christianity, or Descartes, because Aristotle's soul is not a separate thing made of something other than matter, a thing that may therefore exist without a body. Neither is he the dualist modern nemesis, a materialist, denying as had the atomist the existence of soul altogether, because without a soul, a body has no definition, no life, and no purpose. For Aristotle, the soul is the set of capacities of a living body. Just as seeing is the capacity of the eye, soul is the capacity of the body to act. Without an eye, there is no seeing. Without a body, there is no action, no soul. The contemporary movement of embodied cognition may be seen as a return to Aristotle, refusing to see cognition as something that occurs only in the disembodied Platonic or Cartesian mind. All living things have soul, but there are different forms of living things, possessing, therefore, different forms of soul. Specifically, Aristotle distinguished three levels of soul appropriate to different levels of actualization on his natural scale. At the lowest level, there is the At the lowest level, there is the nutritive soul, possessed by plants, serving three functions. 1. Maintaining the individual plant through nutrition. 2. Maintaining the species through reproduction. And 3. Directing growth. Animals possess a more complex sensitive soul, which subsumes the nutritive soul's functions while adding others, making it more fully actualized than the nutritive soul. Animals, unlike plants, are aware of their surroundings. They have sensations, hence sensitive soul. As a consequence of sensation, animals experience pleasure and pain and so feel desire either to seek pleasure or to avoid pain. There are two further consequences of sensation. First, imagination and memory, since experiences can be imagined or recalled. And second, movement as a consequence of desire. Highest in the scale of souls comes the human or rational soul, subsuming the others and adding mind, the power to think and have general knowledge. Moving on to structure and functions of the rational human soul. According to Aristotle, gaining knowledge is a psychological process that starts with the perception of particular objects and ends with general knowledge of universals, of forms. Aristotle's analysis of the soul can be represented by a diagram showing the faculties of the soul and their interrelationships. In many respects, Aristotle's analysis of the sensitive and rational soul resembles that given by modern cognitive psychologists, and I have anachronistically depicted Aristotle's theory as an information processing flowchart of the type made familiar by cognitive psychology. Going on to figure 2.4, the structure of the human, sensitive, and rational soul, according to Aristotle, which surprisingly resembles the modern information processing view of cognition. So we start with the special senses. Here on the left, we have vision, hearing, touch, taste, smell, all leading to common sense. Common sense feeds into imagination and memory, and imagination leads back into common sense along with memory. Common sense leads to the passive mind, and we also have the active mind, and those all act on each other. Going on to this part here, sense perception. Aristotle writes, generally, about all perception, we can say that a sense is what has the power of receiving into itself the sensible forms of things without the matter, in the way in which a piece of wax takes on the impress of a signet ring without the iron or gold. That is, if I look at a bronze statue, my eye receives the form of the statue without receiving its matter, the bronze. Perception, the starting point of knowledge, has to do with form, not matter. By the way, shout out to Kamal in the chat. Shout out to you. Continuing here. The special form by the special senses. Each special sense is dedicated to reception of a particular kind of information about objects, which is why these senses are called special. A better translation might be specialized. Aristotle regarded the special senses as passive, simply conforming themselves to the forms of objects, and therefore reliable and unerring. Plato, as we have seen, was a metaphysical realist. Aristotle was a perceptual realist. He rejected the forms, but taught that in perception our minds receive the form of an object without the matter. Each of the special sensibles, the particular perceptual features of an object, are simply picked up in the act of perception. Thus, if we see a green sweater, we see it as green because it really is green. In the example of color, Aristotle thought that the eye jelly takes on the color of an object, thus registering it in the mind. The conscious object of perception, however, was what Aristotle called a common sensible, and identifying it required an act of judgment. For example, you might see someone you take to be an old friend across the street, only to discover he or she is someone else. You correctly perceived the person's hair color, build, and so on, but came to an incorrect conclusion about his or her identity. Aristotle's perceptual theory allows for cognitive error, but connects the mind directly with the world. Continuing here to interior senses. The information provided by the special senses is passed on to faculties that deal with it in various ways. In the animal soul, these faculties are called the interior senses because they are not connected with the outside world, but still are dealing with the experienced sensations. The first interior sense is common sense. Common sense is an important faculty, being Aristotle's answer to one of the great mysteries of perception, the problem of sensory integration, or as it is known in cognitive neuroscience, the binding problem. Each special sense detects a special kind of information about how an object looks, sounds, feels, tastes, or smells. The physical origin of each sense is distinct. Vision begins with light striking the retina, hearing with sound waves striking the eardrum. The neural path of each special sense into the brain is unique, yet the world as we experience it is not a jumble of disconnected sensations. We hear sounds coming from objects we see, and we expect objects to be touchable. We experience single objects, the common sensibles, with multiple facets, not a blooming, buzzing confusion of sense impressions. Somehow we integrate the information provided by the special senses by binding together their separate neural pathways into a single mental representation of objects. Aristotle said the job was done by common sense. It is the place, Aristotle located it in the heart, where the inputs from the special senses are brought together and coordinated into a single integrated picture of the world, where the sensations are held together in common. Common sense and the next faculty, imagination, are involved in judging what an object is. I see a red spot on a tree, but I must judge whether it is a drop of red paint or a ladybug. Thus, whereas the special sensations are infallible, there can be no doubt that I see a red spot. The judgments of common sense and imagination are fallible interpretations of special sensibles. I may wrongly think I'm seeing a ladybug. We now know that Aristotle was right to draw a sharp distinction between sensing an object and judging what sort of object it is, because the two mental processes are performed in different parts of the brain. For example, there is the syndrome of prosopagnosia, in which people with certain sorts of brain damage, Aristotle was wrong about the heart, these people with brain damage lose the ability to see faces. They see the stimuli that correspond to eyes, nose, mouths, and so on, but they do not integrate them into the perception of a face, even a familiar face, as in the well-known case of the man who mistook his wife for a hat rack. The coherent images of objects assembled by common sense are passed on in two distinctions, to imagination and memory in animals and human beings, and, in human beings alone, to mind. The basic function assigned to imagination by Aristotle is the ability to represent the form of an object in its absence, whether just after it has been presented to common sense or later after retrieval from memory. Imagination, however, is assigned other functions. That were later separated into distinct faculties by medieval physician philosophers. As already mentioned, imagination is involved in judging what an object is, that is, in inferring from sensation what object is affecting our senses. In addition to this purely cognitive function, imagination is involved in feeling pleasure and pain, and in judging whether a perceived object is good or bad for an organism, thereby causing a behavioral response. Thus, a cat sees a mouse and judges that the mouse is good for it, and so it chases the mouse. The mouse, seeing the cat, judges that it is bad for it and runs away. The final faculty of the sensitive or animal soul is memory. Aristotle conceived of memory as a storehouse of the images created by common sense and imagination. It is thus the record of an animal's life, available to be recalled by imagination. Whereas Plato tended to treat memory as reminiscence of absolute truth from the soul's passage through the heavens between incarnations, Aristotle treats it in a more modern way of recall of previous experiences in our earthly lives. Aristotle's memory corresponds to what modern cognitive psychologists call episodic or personal memory, the ability to recall specific events or episodes in one's life. The organization of memory is based on association, as described in many modern psychological theories. Plato hinted at the concept of the association of ideas in his proposal that, by their resemblance to the innate forms, perceived objects led to knowledge. Aristotle, however, discussed the processes of association more fully. Aristotle discussed three laws of association: similarity, contiguity, and contrast. Similar images are associatively linked. Images of contiguous experiences are linked, and opposite images are linked. That is, hot usually elicits the association cold. He also hinted at the law of causality. Causally linked experiences remind us of one another. Cognitive scientists distinguish episodic memory from semantic memory, the ability to recall the definitions of words. Sometimes semantic memory is called simply knowledge because it concerns general ideas, universals, not specific events or things, particulars. Aristotle, too, separated memory from knowledge, acquisition of the latter being the function of the uniquely human part of the soul, mind, or nous. Continuing here, onto Aristotle's conception of the mind. Aristotle called the rational part of the human soul the mind. It is unique to human beings, and its function is acquiring knowledge of abstract universals, as opposed to the knowledge of individual things given in perception. As we experience different members of the same natural type, we note similarities and differences, forming an impression of a universal, which Aristotle believed was always an image. As one experiences a multitude of cats, one eventually forms an idea of what the essence of a cat is, an image of a cat that contains only those perceptual features shared by all cats. To borrow Platonic imagery, my memory stores the remembered forms of our cats, Silver, Theo, and Ginger, but my mind stores the universal concept of the cat. Within the mind, there must be, as Aristotle believed, there to be throughout nature, a difference between potentiality and actuality. The passive mind is potentiality. It has no character of its own, for it can take on the form of experienced objects. Knowledge of universals in the passive mind is actualized, or made manifest, by the operations of the active mind. The active mind is pure thought, acting on the contents of the passive mind to achieve rational knowledge of universals. This active mind is quite different from the other parts of the soul. As actuality, it is not acted on. Rather, it acts on the contents of the passive mind. For Aristotle, this meant that the active mind was unchangeable, hence immortal, for death is a form of change. The active mind is therefore separable from the body and may survive death, unlike the rest of the soul. However, the active mind is not a personal soul, for it is identical in all human beings. It is pure thought and carries nothing away from its sojourn on truth. It is pure thought and carries nothing away from its sojourn on earth. Knowledge is realized only in the passive mind, which perishes. Active mind corresponds to the processes of abstract thought, passive mind to the contents. Later, Neoplatonic, Christian, and Islamic thinkers, otherwise impressed by Aristotle's scientific treatment of the world and human life, had a very difficult time reconciling Aristotle's naturalistic treatment of the soul with their radical dualism of soul and body. Moving on to motivation. Movement is characteristic of animals and thus is a function of the sensitive soul, which can experience pleasure and pain. All action is motivated by some form of desire, which Aristotle believed involved imagination. In animals, motivation is directed by an image of what is pleasurable, and the animal seeks only present pleasure or the avoidance of pain. Aristotle calls this type of motivation appetite. Human beings, however, are capable of reason and so can conceive of right and wrong. Therefore, we can be motivated by desire for what is good or for long-term future benefits. This type of motivation is called wish. Animals experience simple motivational conflicts between opposing appetites, but humans have, in addition, the problem of moral choice. Ethics. Aristotle erected his ethics squarely on his psychology. Just as there is a natural goal to the growth of an acorn, it ought to become a flourishing big oak tree, so there is a natural proper goal to human life, namely human flourishing. Aristotle provided a philosophical basis for the Greek idea that there is only one best way of life, only one path to eudaimonia. Just as oak trees have an inherent nature that they naturally tend to fulfill when conditions are favorable, so human beings have a nature that we tend to fulfill when conditions are favorable. Because the human soul is in its essence rational and therefore capable of virtue, so human good turns out to be activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Aristotle's Greek ethics is very different from the ethical systems of later world religions and the Enlightenment systems we will examine later in this book. Religions such as Christianity and Islam see ethics as a matter of right behavior, defined as following universal rules, such as those found in the Ten Commandments. Important secular philosophers of the Enlightenment replaced divine sanction with reason or calculations of utility, but retained the idea that morality consisted in following fixed rules binding on all rational agents. In short, they brought the epistemological search for universal knowledge to bear on morality. Aristotle did not do this. He separated epistemology from ethics because his ethical focus was on character, virtues such as wisdom and courage, rather than on conduct. He urged people to be good and live well, not simply follow rules. Thus, for Aristotle, morality was a matter of practical reason, phronesis, rather than theoretical reason. The good person must balance virtues to live a life of eudaimonia. Sometimes prudence is better than courageous folly, or mercy is better than righteous wrath. Because the conditions in which a tree or human develops are so important to human flourishing, Aristotle's ethics is at the same time political science. Aristotle emphasizes that becoming virtuous requires learning and practice. One cannot flourish in a society that prevents it. So much did Aristotle emphasize a person's life circumstances in becoming virtuous that he said that people who are wealthy and powerful are potentially more virtuous than the poor and helpless because they are better placed to cultivate virtue and do good things. In this, he was very Greek, bestowing true arete only on a fortunate few. Aristotle's ethics, cum political science, attempted to erase the distinction between physis and nomos that the sophists had drawn so sharply, thus returning to the standard Greek view that the two are ideally the same. Aristotle famously says that by nature, physis, man is a social, or more precisely, political animal. The natural life for human beings is living in society and human flourishing. Eudaimonia depends, therefore, on living in the right kind of ordered society, nomos. However, the ideal state described by Aristotle, like Plato's Republic, would be rejected by and large by modern citizens of the West. As Plato had held, only the wise and virtuous should rule because only they can set aside personal interest and govern in the interest of the state as a whole. As we might agree, a monarchy might be a good state if the king is wise and benevolent, but a better state is one ruled by law rather than the temporary virtues of a moral king. Therefore, Aristotle's ideal state is a sort of aristocratic democracy. The citizens of the state participate in ruling it, but most members of the state are not citizens. The citizens of Aristotle's utopia are not the selected and cultivated guardians of Plato's Republic, but men of independent means who do not work, and who therefore have no personal interest to corrupt their judgment, and who have the time to devote to politics. In the state which is best governed, the citizens must not lead the life of artisans or tradesmen, for such a life is ignoble and inimical to virtue. Neither must they be husbandmen, working farmers and ranchers as opposed to those who had slaves, since leisure is necessary both for the development of virtue and the performance of political duties. In short, Aristotle's ideal society was an aristocratic version of the Athenian polis he knew, otherwise known as the colonial and slightly post-revolutionary United States of America. In conclusion, the common sense naturalist. Plato offered a comprehensive vision of the universe, of human nature, and of people's place in the universe. Aristotle offered a systematic natural philosophy of the universe, human nature, and people's place in the universe. It was systematic because Aristotle used a core set of concepts to analyze everything from the fall of a rock to the proper construction of a dramatic play. More importantly, for the history of science and psychology, it was naturalistic. Aristotle rejected Plato's otherworldly forms and Plato's radical dualism of soul and body for an account of both that referred only to matter and to natural forces. Moreover, Aristotle's sciences were deeply commonsensical. In his physics, heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones, and in his psychology, animals and people do things with purposes in mind. Aristotle's comprehensive yet familiar picture of our world would prove appealing to many later thinkers, but at the same time it clashed with two rival pictures. One, Plato's spiritual picture was already on the scene. The rise of the mystery religions of the Hellenistic period and of the world religions of Christianity and Islam reinforced Plato's vision, and naturalism withered. The scientific revolutions revived naturalism, might have been Aristotle's friend, but its naturalism went further than Aristotle's toward a mechanistic conception of causation that had no room for purpose, either in the actions of animals and people or the development of the universe. In psychology, the right understanding of purpose and explaining behavior would be bitterly contested from the scientific revolution through the coming of cognitive science. In neither physics nor in psychology would common sense prevail. Conclusion: the Greek legacy. Ancient Greeks affected a miracle, thinking about nature and human beings through philosophy and science rather than through revelation. They began the long Western and perhaps human trek towards science, freedom, and democracy. Lies, lies, Liza Minnelli. At the same time, they glorified war and marital prowess in ways few moderns would endorse. Their way of life depended upon slaves who knew neither freedom nor dignity, and they looked upon material production with disdain. This last point would have a lasting impact on the history of science and psychology. We are used today to thinking of science as experimental, but because the Greeks disdained interaction with the physical world, their ideal in science was theoria, passive contemplation of what happens in the natural course of events. It is thus no surprise that the most developed of the ancient sciences was astronomy, in which recording and contemplating the natural movements of the stars and planets is all that is empirically possible. Asking nature questions via experiment, which the early scientist Robert Bacon called twisting the lion's tail, did not occur to the Greeks and would take a long time to enter scientific practice. As we shall see, psychology will play an important role in making experimentation part of science and medicine. The Greek separation of contemplation and action affects how psychologists think about the mind to the present day. Plato's search for the truth ended in simply knowing what the truth is and contemplating the eternal forms. He was little concerned with practical action in the world of everyday life. The guardians contemplated truth while the toiling masses of the productive class actually did things. The separation of contemplation and action is found in a more technical form in Aristotle. When Aristotle initiated the field of logic in his formulation of syllogistic reasoning, he was concerned with laying down rules ensuring that we would form correct beliefs. He separated reasoning about ethics in the practical syllogism. The conclusion of a logical syllogism is a proposition, as in the famous "all men are mortal." Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The conclusion of a practical syllogism is an action and builds on desires. As in drinking water is essential to health, I want to be healthy, therefore I should drink water. A logical syllogism contemplates truth. A practical syllogism leads to behavior. Even today, cognitive psychology textbooks typically treat reasoning and problem solving as separate topics discussed in separate chapters. The first topic is about what to believe. The second is about how to figure out what to do. Recently, a number of cognitive psychologists, philosophers, and researchers in artificial intelligence have become highly critical of the separation of thought and action, creating the embodied cognition movement that focused on how thought is, in fact, always rightly coupled to behavior. Nevertheless, Greek values had a long reach, appealing to people who place contemplation of the beautiful and good, theoria, above everything else. In 1891, the aesthete and author Oscar Wilde gave a talk called The Soul of Man Under Socialism. Although Christianity had subtracted the warrior ethos of eret from European values, Wilde's socialism maintained Greek ideals. The chief advantage that would result from the establishment of socialism is, undoubtedly, the fact that socialism would relieve us from the sordid necessity of living for others. So while humanity will be amusing itself or enjoying cultivated leisure, which and not labor is the aim of man, or making beautiful things, or reading beautiful things, or simply contemplating the world with admiration and delight, machinery will be doing all the necessary and unpleasant work. The fact is that civilization requires slaves. The Greeks were quite right there. Unless there are slaves to do the ugly, horrible, uninteresting work, culture and contemplation become almost impossible. Human slavery is wrong, insecure, and demoralizing. On mechanical slavery, on the slavery of the machine, the future of the world depends. So, I think that further bolsters my point that Western civilization is built on the premise that some people or things need to be subjugated to work for us. But I'll continue here. Chapter 3, Antiquity, 323 BCE to 1000 CE. Classical Antiquity, the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. The social context, Hellenism and Empire. Aristotle's pupil, Alexander the Great, changed the Western world. He sought to establish a universal empire that brought Greek culture to lands he conquered. He failed, but the more practical Romans, who knitted their empire together with common roads, a common language, a common culture, and a common bureaucracy, fulfilled his vision. The life of the small democratic polis was destroyed, eventually replaced by the large multi-ethnic empire of Rome. Rootedness in small parochial communities was replaced by the universal idea of Roman citizenship. A Roman Stoic once said that every Roman is a citizen of two cities, his place of birth in Rome, center of the known world. The idea of a universal empire of reason, of mutual trust, rather than genetic altruism that embraced yet transcended local and ethnic divisions, exerted a powerful influence on the modernizers of the Enlightenment project and the founders of the American Republic. The immediate consequence of Alexander's death, however, was a period of intense and disturbing social change known as the Hellenistic period, usually dated from his death to the final conquest of Egypt by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, in 31 BCE. Until the coming of the Pax Romana, the Eastern Mediterranean was in turmoil. Alexander's imperial center did not hold. His generals carved his hoped-for empire into personal kingdoms that they ruled like gods, and they and their heirs fought incessant wars with each other. Having lost their beloved polis, Hellenistic men and women turned away from public life toward the pleasures of private life at home. Rejecting Homeric fame and classical Greek politics, a Stoic said what no older Greek could ever have, that nothing in life can compare with the companionship of a man and wife. From a social perspective, the great gainers of the Hellenistic era were women, as the idea of marriage as a contract to begin heirs was replaced by ideas of love and lifelong partnership. The cynic Crates married for love and lived in full equality with his wife, Hipparchia, in what they called their dog marriage. Most surprising to traditionalist Greeks, they even went on to dinner. They even went out to dinner together. Most surprising to traditionalist Greeks, they even went out to dinner together. Okay. That's just funny. That's very interesting because I'm thinking about the movie 300 and how they made. I think the main character's name was Leonidas. They made him seem like this trad cath who lived out on a little house on the prairie with his trad wife. And like these evil brown people came into his city, so now it was his duty to like beat them back. And like he kissed his wife goodbye, when like if this really happened, like Leonidas would kiss one of his homies and then they both pick up swords and go out and fight the Persians, who are just trying to bring them, I don't know, literature. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, very interesting that the Stoics, I did not know that the Stoics were the first to talk about marriage between a man and a woman is sacred and it's about love and companionship. Very interesting. Anyway, psychologically, however, the uncertainties of the Hellenistic epoch were more disturbing. The traditional Greek fear of Tyche was strengthened by the travails of life under the warring kings. The leading dramatist of the era, Menander, wrote, "Stop going on about human intelligence. It's fortune's intelligence that steers the world. Human forethought is hot air, mere babble." As Hellenes turned inward to their homes, they also turned inward to their souls, seeking succor from the misfortunes of the world. The more secular of them sought freedom from upset in philosophy, and the more religious in traditional worship or in exotic new religions that flowed from the east into the west. In between was the philosophical religion of Neoplatonism. All right, going here to this part here. I'm just going to read this figure. Figure 3.1, the Anglo-Saxon Church of Escombe in England, one of the oldest churches in England, and still in use as an Anglican church. It is an excellent symbol of the great disruption in Western history that occurred with the fall of the Roman Empire. Many of the stones in the fabric of this church were taken from a nearby Roman fort. For the Anglo-Saxons, the Romans were only a dim memory, and they literally picked up the pieces of the past to create a new way of life. Very interesting. So, therapeutic philosophies of happiness. In a disturbing world, people sought freedom from disturbance, a form of happiness Greeks called ataraxia. The classical Greeks had sought the happiness of eudaimonia, human flourishing or living well. Hellenistic Greeks and the Romans who followed them lowered their sights and settled for ataraxia, a happiness that was within their own control. As we have learned, Greek eudaimonia depended on luck, including living in favorable circumstances. When Tyche was unfavorable, as it was during the wars of Alexander's successors, eudaimonia was placed out of reach. What lay within reach was the ability to quiet one's own soul, to achieve self-mastery, and thus personal freedom from disturbance, no matter what fortune might bring. Recipes for achieving ataraxia were offered by a new form of philosophers, the philosopher as physician. If the physician as philosopher, figures such as Alcmaeon, Empedocles, and Aristotle began the story of psychology as science, the philosopher as physician begins the story of psychology as psychotherapy. The Hellenistic schools of philosophy set out to create and teach a therapy of the soul. Their philosophies also touched religious themes. Are there gods? Is there an afterlife? How may I be saved? By addressing these questions at a personal and philosophical level, Hellenistic philosophies downplayed the role of cult worship, helping pave the way for a religion of personal redemption, Christianity. I really don't like his teleological type of way of telling history, because the way he tells, Greek philosophical history, or the scientific history of philosophy leading to psychology. He tells it almost in this way like, the Greeks were building this foundation and bedwork that would lead up to modern American Protestantism. Ugh, gross. No, you know what I mean? I'm not feeling that. But I'm going to read here. Continuing. Epicureanism. Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus, who was born 341 and died in 270 BCE, was one of the most influential of the Hellenistic therapeutic philosophies. Epicurus spoke for all the schools when he wrote, "Empty is that philosopher's argument by which no human suffering is therapeutically treated. For just as there is no use in a medical art that does not cast out the sickness of bodies, so too there is no use in philosophy, unless it casts out suffering of the soul." And when he defined pleasure, ataraxia, as the absence of pain in the body and of trouble in the soul, Epicureanism is also known as the philosophy of the garden, because part of Epicurus's recipe for ataraxia is withdrawal from the world to live a quiet life of philosophy and friendship. Epicurus taught that happiness was to be found by avoiding strong passions, including the ups and downs of erotic love, and living simply, avoiding dependence on others or the world. For Epicurus, then, the greatest good is prudence, not arete, whether earned by glory or in battle or serving the polis through politics. To allay fear of death, Epicurus accepted atomism, teaching that there was no soul and thus no possibility of suffering in the afterlife. There was also a cult-like aspect to Epicureanism. Epicureans addressed Epicurus as leader, had to promise to accept all his teachings, and were admonished always to behave as though Epicurus is watching. The success of his garden also depended on his wealth, the donations that supported the movement, and the slaves who tended him and his circle. This isn't the Epicurus from Egypt, right? Because there was a black Epicurus, but I think that was the mathematician. Anyway, I'm going to continue here. Cynicism. The most controversial of the happiness philosophies was cynicism. Epicureanism was part philosophy and part lifestyle. Cynicism was all lifestyle, and the cynics were the hippies of Hellenism. Epicureans withdrew physically from the world, but cynics remained in the world but not of it. They believed that one should live as naturally as possible, utterly rejecting worldly conventions, contemptuous of whatever opinions people might have, all phusis and no nomos. The most famous cynic was Diogenes, born 400 and died in 325 BCE, whose proud nickname was the dog, because he lived as dogs live, outside social convention. He would urinate and defecate in public as dogs do. Found masturbating in the marketplace, his only remark was that he wished hunger could be as easily assuaged. Plato called him Socrates gone mad. Diogenes proclaimed himself a citizen of the world and said the greatest good was free speech. To the extent that there was a therapeutic philosophy in the Cynic, it resembled Epicurus's advice to reject society, control the emotions, and avoid too much pleasure. The Cynic, Antisthenes, said, "I would rather go mad than experience pleasure." Skepticism. More philosophical than either Epicureanism or Cynicism was the school of skepticism, founded by Pyrrho of Elis, who was born in 320 and died in 270 BCE. Skeptics divided philosophical schools into three kinds: dogmatists, academics, and skeptics, depending on the attitude each held toward the ability of humans to know the truth. Dogmatists, such as Platonists, Aristotelians, and the skeptics' chief adversaries, the Stoics, conceited braggers to skeptical eyes, claimed to know what truth was. Academics, heirs to Plato's Academy, claimed that humans could not know the truth at all, but should modestly aim at Socrates' aporia. Skeptics, said Sextus Empiricus, who flourished in 200 CE, the chief chronicler of skepticism, keep on searching for truth. Okay, so the skeptics are just like searching for truth and they just doubt everything. A psychologically interesting aspect of skeptical rejection of dogmatic assertions involved appeal to individual differences. As empiricists, skeptics rejected Plato's forms in favor of basing knowledge in appearances. However, they elaborated on the sophist's observation that how things appear to one person may not be the same as how they appear to another, depending on the immediate circumstances of observation, the physical state and different personalities of the observers, and the cultural differences between them. Moreover, skeptics noted that different sensory abilities of animals compared to humans, such as a dog's superiority at hearing and smelling. Thus, the possibility of attaining truth through observation of the world was daunting, although skeptics did not conclude it was impossible, as academics did. Despite their development of empiricist epistemology, the goal and motivation of skepticism was the same as the other Hellenistic happiness philosophies. The originating cause of skepticism is, we say, the hope of attaining quietude. Skeptical epistemology suggested that one should never believe one has the truth, as dogmatists did. Instead, skeptics suspended judgment about what was naturally good or bad, and did not pursue anything eagerly. Doing so, they found quietude, as if by chance, followed upon their suspense, and they were not perturbed by what befell them. Stoicism. The most influential of all the therapeutic philosophies was Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium, born in 333 and died in 262 BCE. Zeno taught at the painted colonnade, or Stoa, in Athens. Stoicism was a general and genuine philosophy that was developed for centuries by Greeks and Romans. Its appeal was considerable, cutting across social lines. It counted among its adherents both a slave, Epictetus, and an emperor, Marcus Aurelius. Epictetus was born in 50 BCE and died in 138 CE. And Marcus Aurelius was born in 121 CE and died in 180 CE. All right. So, Stoicism was effectively the philosophy of the Roman ruling class. In addition to philosophy, the Stoics worked in science and made tremendous advances in logic. Their major contribution to philosophy and mathematics was their development of the concepts of the proposition and of propositional logic. Earlier philosophers had thought of knowledge in terms of mental imagery. Plato's forms and the essences stored in Aristotle's passive mind were idealized images of objects stripped of those features that did not define the form or essence. Thus, the form or essence of a car was the image, thus the form or essence of a cat was the image of a cat that did not possess a particular color, size, or even a tail. Manx cats don't have them, because these features vary from cat to cat, and therefore do not define the forms or essence of a cat. Psychologically, for Plato and Aristotle, then, the contents of the mind were all images, whether particular images representing individual things we've met, or generic images representing ideal forms and essence. The Stoics moved in a dramatically different direction, defining representations linguistically as propositions. A proposition is a statement that is either true or false. They can concern individuals, as in the proposition, Ginger, one of our cats, is on the mat, or concern statements about universal knowledge, as in the proposition, if a creature is a cat, then it eats meat. Logical reasoning then became a matter of properly combining sets of propositions according to logical rules, thus generating new propositions. For example, if I'm told if a creature is a cat, then it eats meat, and Ginger is a cat, then I can infer that Ginger eats meat. The development of the concept of propositional reasoning was of tremendous long-term importance for logic, computation, and cognitive psychology. If one thinks of knowledge as imagery, it is hard to think about highly abstract concepts such as truth or the good. We can sort of imagine combining all the cats we've seen into a generic picture of a cat, but thinking of an image of justice that includes repaying a loan, writing a constitution, and aiding the poor is difficult to the point of impossibility. Moving away from images also makes it possible to think of reasoning as a set of rules that has no concrete content at all. Thus, if told, if P then Q, and P is true, then one may infer that Q is true. It does not matter if P and Q are cats, meats, dogs, planets, people, virtues, money, or just letters. The sentence before this one was an if, then proposition itself. If the rules are followed correctly, a valid conclusion will be reached. Thought can thus be conceived as a toolkit adaptable to any ideas, whatever, not just those derived from our direct experience. In the early 20th century, psychologists would discover that people do not always reason with images. After World War II, the field of artificial intelligence would be created when Herbert Simon and Alan Newell, economists and psychologists, come to think of computers as propositional reasoners, not just glorified numerical calculators. They would then argue that people are propositional reasoners too, creating the leading theory in cognitive psychology to this day, the symbol system concept of mind. As a theory of the soul, Stoicism taught two interconnected things: absolute determinism and the complete extirpation of the emotions. The Stoics believed that whatever happens in one's life was foreordained to happen. As the Roman politician and writer Marcus Tullius Cicero put it, the evolution of time, it is like the unwinding of a cable. It creates nothing new but unfolds each event in its order. However, we are in control of our mental world, so feeling unhappy about misfortune is our fault and may be corrected with Stoic teaching. Strong positive feelings are also to be avoided because they lead to overvaluation of things and people, and thus to potential unhappiness should they be lost. These sayings from the Enchiridion, or Handbook of Epictetus, convey the flavor of Stoicism. Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions. Stoics regarded emotions as opinions about the things. So men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by their opinions about the things. For example, death is nothing terrible, for if it were, it would have seemed so to Socrates. For the opinion about death, that it is terrible, is a terrible thing. When, then, we are impeded or disturbed or grieved, let us never blame others but ourselves, that is, our opinions. It is the act of an ill-instructed man to blame others for his own bad condition. It is the act of one who has begun to be instructed to lay the blame on himself, and of one whose instruction is completed, neither to blame another nor himself. These reasonings do not cohere. I am richer than you, therefore I am better than you. I am more eloquent than you, therefore I am better than you. On the contrary, these rather cohere. I am richer than you, therefore my possessions are greater than yours. I am more eloquent than you, therefore my speech is superior to yours. But you are neither possession nor speech. In everything, circumstance, we should hold these maxims ready to hand. Lead me, O Zeus, and thou, O Destiny, the way that I am bid by you to go. To follow I am ready. If I choose not, I make myself a wretch and still must follow. But who so nobly yields unto necessity, we hold him wise and skilled in things divine. The Stoics recognized the difficulty of perfecting their path to ataraxia, recognizing that only God was perfect, and that their goal of becoming one with instruction is completed, can be moved toward but never quite attained, and that therefore all men are to some degree unhappy, no matter how far instructed. Stoics spoke of the wise man we should try to be. The wise man never opines, never regrets, never is mistaken, never changes his mind. Note in saying that we just read, XLIV, Note in saying XLIV that the Stoics rejected the old Greek concept of elite aret. Neither greatness of wealth, the virtue of the Bronze Age kings and aristocrats, nor greatness of eloquence, the virtue of the democratic polis, is really virtue at all. They are merely accidental possessions. For the Stoic, virtue was a state of mind, inner mastery of emotions, and anyone, male or female, rich or poor, slave or emperor, warrior or businessman, could achieve this inner state of mind. Stoicism thus marks a sharp break with traditional Greek ethics, anticipating and influencing Christianity. Rolling my eyes. Every time he mentions Christianity, roll my eyes. In this connection, the Stoics created a uniquely Western idea, the idea of personal conscience, which they called syneidesis, translated into Latin as conscientia. For the Stoics, right and wrong involved more than knowing and obeying the laws, or nomos, of one's society, but was an inwardly felt sense of sin connected with one's inner voice of reason, or logos, which was in turn connected to the divine logos of the universe. In the confusing Hellenistic world in which law and custom varied from place to place, and in the Roman world where one's emperor's decrees overturned another's, the Stoic ideal of conscience held out the promise that individual people knew in their minds what was rationally right and wrong, whatever kings and emperors and later popes might decree. In many respects, Stoicism was like Christianity, and its popularity in the Roman Empire aided the reception of and also influenced Christian thought. Unlike earlier Greek philosophies, Stoicism was universal rather than elitist. Anyone, slave or emperor, could aspire to be a Stoic sage. Stoics thought of the universe as a living and divine being, ruled by reason or logos and permeated by spirit or pneuma. Determinism was easier to accept if one believed that the wise universe was rationally working out an ultimately good plan, and that one's personal happiness was rationally accepting the logos of the universe. Like Christian martyrs, the Stoics calmly endured pain in the service of a higher purpose. Humans had spirits, their own pneumas, if not souls, because the Stoics held that at death one's pneuma simply returned to the universes. So there was for them no personal immortality. The influence of Stoicism on Christianity is displayed in the Gospel according to John. The Stoics were masters of logic, but logos also means word, and John's Gospel begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God." The therapeutic philosophies of happiness offered one way of dealing with the confusing and changing world, and we have seen that all the happiness philosophies proposed an unpolis-like degree of disentanglement from the world. The Epicureans withdrew from the world physically, the Cynic withdrew from the social world of nomos, the Skeptic withdrew from strong belief of any kind, the Stoic refused to let the world's troubles be disturbing. Another way of dealing with the troubling world was to turn away from it to a better, purer, transcendent one. As happiness philosophies multiplied in the Hellenistic world, so did new forms of religion. All right. So we're going to keep reading, by the way. We're going to read for about 5 more minutes, and then we're going to call it a day. Hopefully you enjoyed this live stream. Hopefully you found it very useful. So let's go here. Historians, all right, the Greek miracle in reverse. Historians speak of the negating nature, human nature, in society through reason rather than revelation. We have studied this miracle in the history of psychology from Alcmaeon to Zeno. However, in the Hellenistic period, faith in philosophy and science faltered, and many people turned away from reason and to secret revelations as the source of truth. Gnosticism and Hermeticism. One sign of the search for secret revelations was a movement within Christianity and Judaism called Gnosticism. In Greek, gnostis or gnosis means knowledge, though not the philosophical knowledge of natural philosophy, but the knowledge of secret teachings or secret interpretations of sacred texts. Gnostic Christians, for example, believed in the existence of gospels beyond the 4 recognized by the Catholic Church. These Gnostic Gospels, such as the Gospel of Thomas, were said to contain deeper truths than those of the Synoptic Gospels. They were held in secret by Gnostic teachers and revealed to their students in a series of stages in which the students were gradually initiated into what the Gnostics said were the real secrets of Christ, unknown and dangerous to ordinary believers. Another example of the Greek miracle in reverse was Hermeticism. Hermeticists believed that the ancient Egyptians had unraveled all the secrets of the universe and that they had been written down by a divine figure called Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes, a Greek god, thrice great. The Hermetic documents later turned out to have been written not in ancient Egypt, but in the 1st century CE. Gnosticism and Hermeticism are symptoms of profound loss of confidence in Greek culture. Hellenistic people were no longer boldly exploring nature through reason and observation, but were turning to allegedly divine revelations from gods and supposedly ancient authorities to whom powerful secrets had been revealed. Western philosophy would not regain its self-confidence until about 1000 CE. And going on to Neoplatonism. We're going to wrap up with Neoplatonism. This will be the last section we read today. As we have seen, Plato's philosophy had a strong otherworldly pull, and during the Hellenistic period, as Plato's academy turned to skepticism, that pull produced the philosophy of Neoplatonism, whose best-known spokesman was Plotinus, born 204 and died in 270 CE, an Egyptian Greek. Plotinus fully developed the mystical aspect of Platonism, very nearly turning that philosophy into a religion. He described the universe as a hierarchy beginning with a supreme and unknowable God called the One. The One emanates a knowable God called intelligence, which rules over Plato's realm of the forms. From intelligence, more divine creatures serially emanate until we reach humans, whose divine souls are imprisoned in degrading material bodies. The physical world is an imperfect and pure copy of the divine realm. Plotinus's concern was to turn his followers' eyes away from the corrupting temptations of the flesh and toward the spiritual world of truth, goodness, and beauty in the realm of the forms. In his Enneads, Plotinus wrote, "Let us rise to the model from which the physical world derives. Over it presides pure intelligence and incredible wisdom. Everything there is eternal and immutable, and in a state of bliss." The last phrase marks the change from Platonic philosophy to the ecstatic vision of religious mysticism, or religious mystics. The last phrase marks the change from Platonic philosophy to the ecstatic vision of religious mystics. Let us rise to the model from which the physical world derives. Over it presides pure intelligence and incredible wisdom. Everything there is eternal and immutable, and in a state of bliss. Like Stoicism, Neoplatonism helped pave the way for and shaped Christian thought. It was through Neoplatonism that Plato's philosophy came to dominate the early Middle Ages. The tendency of Neoplatonism to become a religion is well illustrated in the remarkable life of Hypatia of Alexandria, born in 355 and died in 415 CE, one of the very few women philosophers and scientists of pre-modern times. Hypatia wrote notable works on mathematics and astronomy that are now lost, but her chief claim to fame and influence lay in her teaching of Neoplatonism to numerous and eager students. She regarded her scientific works as doorways to the secrets of Neoplatonism, astronomy being a science that opens the doors to ineffable theology, quoted by Dzekla, 1995 on page 54. Mathematics, according to Hypatia, was the fruit of the godlike. Mathematics was the fruit of the godlike Pythagoras, according to Hypatia. As was typical for teachers of Neoplatonism, Hypatia was regarded as a divine and sacred figure. As a woman, her sacred status was especially exalted by her virginity and her renunciation of sexual pleasure. Also, typically of Neoplatonists, as well as Gnostics and Hermeticists, she sought to keep the divine secrets of philosophy confined to an exalted and purified elite, an aristocracy with exclusive access to the company of the Blessed Lady. As a Neoplatonist, she regarded philosophy as a religious mystery and sought to lead her students to find within themselves the luminous child of reason, an inner eye that would, in the end, lead to an ecstatic merging with the one of Plato, a merging with the one of reason. As a Neoplatonist, Hypatia regarded philosophy as a religious mystery and sought to lead her students to find within themselves the luminous child of reason, an inner eye that would in the end lead them to an ecstatic merging with the one of Plotinus. Links between Neoplatonism and Christianity became clear in the life and teachings of Hypatia. As a virgin, she lived a life recommended to women by St. Paul and St. Jerome, and two of her students became bishops in the Christian church. Nevertheless, the Bishop of Alexandria, Cyril, resentful of her political influence on the Christian governor of Alexandria, branded her a witch for teaching astrology, her astronomy, and had her murdered by her personal thugs. Damn. Nevertheless, the Bishop of Alexandria, Cyril, resentful of her political influence on the Christian governor of Alexandria, branded her a witch for reading astrology, her astronomy, and had her murdered by his personal thugs. Her murder made her a martyr for free thought down to modern times. Damn, Hypatia was a real one. Damn. Centuries later, Friedrich Nietzsche said that Christianity was Platonism for the people because it did for the many what elite Hellenistic philosophies had done for the elite few. It devalued the quest for office, honor, and fame and made citizenship less important than the private purification of the soul. In his letter to the Thessalonians, Paul urges Christians to find honor in being quiet, minding private affairs. Hellenistic philosophy, religion, and Christianity overthrew ancient Greek arete. Also overthrown were Greek ideas about sexual pleasure. Greeks reveled in sexual pleasure, provided nothing was done to excess. But as we have seen, there was an alternative, more ascetic view of the pleasure of the flesh, began by Pythagoras and nurtured by Plato and the Neoplatonists. They all despised the body as a tomb and sought to free the soul from the corrupting desires of the body. The classically educated Paul assimilated this attitude into Christianity. Writing to Galatians, Paul wrote, "The desires of the flesh are against the spirit, and the desire of the spirit are against the flesh." And we're going to wrap it up right there. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this interesting, or as interesting as I found it. This is a very dope book so far, minus the Islamophobia every now and then. But shout out to Thomas Hardy Leahey, and shout out to you for sticking to the end. Hopefully you learned something here. If you have any questions or comments, put them in the chat. We will try to reply to them. I will catch you tomorrow during our episode 8 read. Y'all be easy out there, and peace.